Give me a little intro there, Gomer.
There's no turning back now.
Let's put on the show.
You're listening to episode 111 of the Station 71 podcast. My name is Mario, and this week I'm joined by my co-hosts.
Brian?
And Kirsten.
So this week we've got a history episode coming up, one that Brian's definitely very excited about. Going to give us the history of Fort Wilderness this week. First, let's dive into some of the news topics that we've got going on around Walt Disney World. Looks like the 2020 food guide for the International Festival of the Arts has come out. I know we talk about this festival a lot. This is probably my favorite of the Epcot festivals.
Yeah, me too.
Was there anything on here that like caught your eye?
I'm excited because this will be my first time to go.
Oh, that's very exciting.
Ooh, shrimp ceviche.
I think this is definitely my favorite festival. And I don't know if that's because it's newer, it's shorter. Like, I don't know what it is about it, but I think this just strikes like the right notes for me in terms of like Epcot festival.
Yeah.
And the food is like
chocolate. I'm sorry, I'm still looking at the food. This chocolate peanut butter and pretzel crunch looks good. I'm assuming that's what's in this picture, since there's a pretzel on it.
Ooh, yeah.
I would highly recommend the bread bowl with the cheese inside in France. That was like my favorite thing.
Ooh, they have a wine that I'll actually drink.
Which wine was that?
I only drink Moscato.
Okay.
So, where's that? Showcase Plaza. Don't know where that is.
That's wait, you said it was World Showcase Plaza?
It just says Showcase Plaza. I know where the World Showcase is.
No, I don't know what the Showcase Plaza is.
Yeah, what do they mean by that?
I don't know. I started to look at it's hold on, I have
Everything's
from
in
all yours that
Showcase
pop up.
Plaza, it looks like, except for the stuff in Canada.
It's right when you walk into World Showcase. It doesn't say where it is though. I feel like this is something that I should know.
Are
where
they
it is.
considering this that area over there, like kind of in between the main entrance in Canada, where some of those new booths are off to the side?
Probably.
Okay. Yeah, because I think that's where they put.
Oh, it says okay.
I
So this
definitely
thing
remember
says
that
Showcase
Pop Eats
Plaza.
being over there.
This article on allears.net says Showcase Plaza is located at the entrance of World Showcase. This is the area surrounding the two tower shops. So I guess it's like that little hub right before you walk in.
Okay.
I'm actually a really big art person. I love buying like original art, and that's like what I try to only keep in my house. So I'm excited to see like the actual art stuff too, because y'all know I'm not big on like,
Souvenirs.
I don't know, gaudy character stuff. Like, I prefer stuff where people don't actually realize that it's Disney. So,
You said you've never been before?
mm-mm.
Oh, it's
I
fun.
think
Yeah, this is
for sure.
You're gonna have a good time at this one, and when you come back, you'll have to tell us what you think about it, because I know that this is all pretty high on our rankings.
I'm glad that it keeps getting bigger every year. Like they're making it into an actual thing more so than it used to be.
Well, and I like that it's not expanding to be too big, but it's getting like they're getting more stuff. Like, I don't want festivals year round, even though that's what Epcot seems like it's going towards.
Yeah, I feel like that too.
But
it's like
this
a
is
double-edged
nice.
sword.
Yeah, and this is nice because it kind of breaks that up. Like, it's different enough that it works well for, what it is. So next thing on our news topics that we have on here is that tickets have gone on sale for the summer 2020 H2 Glow Nights at Typhoon Lagoon. This is the after hours party that they had last year that is inspired by the Toy Story short Partysaurus Rex. I don't think any of us actually did this, did we? I know we talked about it last year, but
I had a friend that did it though, and it was very highly recommended.
Yeah, I heard really good things about this event, and it's nice that they're doing some after hours stuff at the water parks too.
Yeah, I love the water parks. I mean, as far as the extra cost late night additional things, this one's way cheaper than the ones at the park, so I might have to give this one a shot.
So the description of this event, if anybody doesn't remember from last year, it says, from meeting all your favorite Toy Story 4 characters to trying specialty themed food and beverage menu items, there's so much to do and see at Disney's H2 Glow Nights. So it's kind of like the after hours events at the parks, but in a water park. So that's kind of neat. I think that this is something that I might actually give a shot. I don't think I've ever actually considered the after hours like park events, but this might do it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last thing that we have on here is that the scaffolding's been removed and the sign has been installed for Remy's Ratatouille Adventure at Epcot. So we're getting that much closer.
Glad, it looks exactly like the movie.
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of that.
That was the thing that I saw on here that I was like really excited about. I was like, oh, they actually just dropped the sign from the movie into the France Pavilion.
I hope that it stays kind of like this and it's a little like it's more subtle. Because I know we've said this several times, but I don't want to see World Showcase get completely overtaken by IPs, but I don't mind it as much if it's more subtle like this.
Yeah, like looking at this first picture, I was kind of like, oh, wow. But then when they actually show it like zoomed out with the backdrop, it is actually not that noticeable.
Yeah, it's a very, it blends in really well. And I think once the actual scaffolding that's in front of it comes down, it'll look even better.
Mm-hmm.
Ratatouille is a severely underrated movie, so I'm excited.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I also don't want Epcot to be taken over by IP, even though that's what's going to happen.
It's where it's going.
Everything is being taken over by IP.
So I'm going to turn it over to Brian then, because as everybody knows, history is your thing.
This one I'm doubly excited about because any longtime listeners to the podcast will know that I love doing history episodes, and I really, really love Fort Wilderness. I've mentioned on here before that when I was growing up, Fort Wilderness was like my family's go-to place to stay, and it was weird for me almost when we started going to hotels because Fort Wilderness, when I thought Disney, I thought, oh, yeah, you go camping and then you go to all these awesome theme parks. And it wasn't until I had gotten a little bit older that I realized that, no, most people stay at the hotels, that the campground is actually kind of the odd thing to do while you're there. So anyways, I've always, always, always loved Fort Wilderness. And it's always had a really special place in my heart as far as Disney goes. So I've wanted to do this episode for a long time, and I'm really excited that I'm finally getting to do it. So anyways, I will start off this history episode in the early 1960s when Walt and Roy were in the beginning stages of planning for an East Coast theme park. They were mainly looking to improve on what had been done at Disneyland, and one of the main focuses that Walt had was acquiring more land this time around. Back in Anaheim, right after Disneyland opened, a lot of businesses and especially hotels purchased property that was directly adjacent to the parks. And due to their proximity, many of them could be seen by guests within the park. And that really detracted from the theming that Walt and the Imagineers focused so heavily on. And furthermore, after a number of successful years, expansions to Disneyland weren't cost effective due to the exponential increase of land prices right next to the theme park. So Walt wanted to make sure that this didn't happen again on the East Coast. So after surveying a number of different locations, he eventually found the area that we now know as Disneyland. And the location ticked nearly every box for him. The Florida weather would allow the park to be open year-round. This location was close to the Florida Turnpike, and it was also close to I-4, which had a network of roads pretty well established around it already. But the most important thing was that this land was absolutely dirt cheap. But Walt knew that things wouldn't stay that way, just like they had done in Anaheim, if he didn't go into this without a plan. So he knew that as soon as the landowners heard that it was him and the Disney company that were trying to buy up all this land, that all the sellers would jack up the prices and that they would not have enough money to purchase the amount that they were really wanting to. So a lot of big Disney fans will know this story, but for those that don't, in order to avoid inflating the cost of the land purchase, Disney set up a number of dummy corporations whose sole job would be to buy up the land and then sell it back to Disney. And a lot of these corporations, quote, quote, were just run by people that Walt put in charge of them. So he comes up with all these more or less fake companies, including, I love some of the names of these, obviously the Reedy Creek Ranch Corporation, which Reedy Creek Improvement District became a huge part of Disney history. And then probably my favorite was the I-4 Corporation. That's AYEFORE Corporation, kind of just a play on the location they were buying all this. But in 1964, all of these dummy corporations started purchasing up all these plots of land in the area. And it worked exactly like Walt had planned it to. Most of the plots were undeveloped swampland, and it didn't require much prodding to the owners to get them to sell it. A lot of the plots were acquired for $100 or less per acre. And one of the other things that Walt did with this whole plan that he had was that he would go in and have the dummy corporations buy the land and get them under contract, but then stall. And what this allowed them to do was to have pretty much all the plots ready to go under contract, but they wouldn't be purchased until they were all under contract and ready to go, so that when they were eventually bought and then sold off to Disney, there wouldn't be reports on that, and everybody wouldn't know who was actually buying up all the land. So anyways, eventually it was found out that it was Disney buying all this land, but at that point he had purchased over 30,000 acres and was pretty much ready to go with development.
Can I add, Kristen? So this might be common knowledge and people might not even think it's interesting, but back then a lot of the land actually was sold to people who had never been there or seen it. Land purchasing was like a big quote unquote like investment back then. And so there were like magazines and they would have classifieds where you could just like buy, you know, a plot of land here or there. And so finding the owners was actually really hard because a lot of it was tiny plots everywhere of people who had never seen it and just like bought their land from a magazine, which is kind of not very common for people to do anymore.
So now the Disney company was sitting on this massive blank canvas to continue what they had started in Anaheim. At this point, the Imagineers knew that the encroachment to theming wasn't the only issue that they had at Disneyland due to the lack of land. Many of the hotels that bought up the land around Disneyland in Anaheim, they more or less became what Disney thought of as the temporary homes for their visitors while they were there at the park. And because, Disney wasn't the one running them, that Disney magic more or less ended as soon as guests left Disneyland. Even the Disneyland Hotel, which I believe its opening only had something like 150 rooms or so, it actually wasn't even owned or operated by Disney until the late 80s when Michael Eisner came in and bought it out and finally actually had it running by Disney. And because of this, Disney had basically no control over the quality of the rooms or the cost of lodging for guests that were coming to the parks. So at Disney World, on the other hand, was planned to be more of an all-inclusive resort destination. And even though the Magic Kingdom was the central focus of the development at this time, Disney and the Imagineers really wanted to take full advantage of all the space that they had. Since they wouldn't have any issues for outside hotels affecting sight lines, they were ready to go forward. And one of the biggest things, though, is that they didn't want the possibility of guest experience to be tarnished from, accommodations of questionable quality, we'll say. They wanted to make sure that the entire time that guests were at Disney World, that they were living that Disney experience. But possibly the most important part of all this was that having the resorts on property would give Disney control over the prices that guests paid while they were staying there. So because of that, with all this extra space, Disney started with plans to develop a number of themed hotels. And initially, these were mainly catered to people that had more to spend. We would now know them as deluxe hotels today. So even casual fans of Walt Disney World know about the Polynesian and the Contemporary resorts, which opened with Magic Kingdom in 1971. But there were also other ones that were planned to be included in the Seven Seas Lagoon / Bay Lake area. And these were the Persian, Asian, and Venetian themed hotels. And we know that obviously these never came to light today, but it was planned that, near the Magic Kingdom, and some of these were even going to be included on the monorail loop, that there would be even more of these really high-end deluxe hotels at Disney's opening. Ooh, lost my spot. So Disney also wanted to add budget-friendly options for guests and not only have them have to pay a lot of money for these deluxe resorts. Since Walt was such a huge lover of adventure in the outdoors, he thought that a campground would be a really great addition to this. They had this huge amount of land, and they thought that this would be something great that they could expand on and really put in to give people, a wide variety of options of where to stay. So before his death in 1966, it was pretty much decided that Disney World was going to open with this campground.
So this was supposed to be the budget-friendly option?
It was. And I mean, it
kind of is.
I will say, if you own a camper, then staying at Fort Wilderness is probably going to be your cheapest option. That's
it's like $67 a night.
Mm-hmm. And obviously now it's kind of a niche market because you have to, you are planning to go to Disney, you have to, pull the camper there, or I know there's companies that you can pay that will set up a camper for you and everything, but then that kind of takes away the cost effectiveness of it. So, you have to factor in the extra cost of hauling a camper there and, all that kind of stuff. But, there's also some things about staying at the campground that kind of do help with cost, which if you think about, like, if you're packing a lot of your own food too and doing like cookouts and that kind of stuff, that's a whole lot cheaper than eating at the restaurants for every meal. So I think if you do have a camper and you're kind of like set up and you have all that gear already, that Fort Wilderness is still like the cheapest way you can do it while staying on property. So as we were moving forward into the new decade, the development for Magic Kingdom and these deluxe resorts were in full swing. And as we all know, as this was getting closer and closer to opening date, a lot of setbacks hit, both physical and budgetary, as construction hit issues, and it quickly became apparent that this was going to take a lot more money than it was originally thought. So at this point, almost everybody was working on either the Magic Kingdom or these deluxe resorts, and the campground had become more or less forgotten about by anyone on the development team. In fact, depending on who you ask, it literally had been forgotten. The story goes that around the fall of 1970, now mind you, this is a year before Disney World is set to open, Executive VP and COO Card Walker contacted VP of Operations of Disney World, Dick Nunes, for an update on the campground, and Dick replied, "What campground?" And Card had to remind him that they were supposed to be developing a campground at Walt Disney World along with the resort hotels. Whoops.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah. But time was running short, and Dick Nunes wasn't really able to just pull anybody off that was working on the Polynesian or the Contemporary, so he had a bit of an issue on his hand. He reached out to Keith Camback, who was a former Disneyland employee, and he was brought over to Disney World to be responsible for pool, marina, and recreation areas for the entire project. Nunes thought that because of this experience and the fact that Camback had a degree in recreation, he'd be a suitable candidate for the development of the campground. Camback told Nunes that he had absolutely no experience with campgrounds and assumed that that was just kind of the end of it. However, Nunes channeled his inner Walt, and either by faith in his abilities or a complete lack of options, told Camback that the task was his. He was going to be in charge of designing the campground for Walt Disney World. So, Camback got tasked with like the coolest job ever, and basically for 6 months just went around to different campgrounds around the U.S., touring them, staying at them, and getting an idea of what would really make a good campground. He comes back to Disney World in the spring of 71 and is ready to hit the ground running and develop this campground resort that he's been researching. However, when he gets back to Florida, he realized that while he was gone, that literally nothing had been done to help him out, and that the entire plot of land that was set aside for Fort Wilderness was 100% untouched. It was not cleared. It was a heavily wooded area, and he was basically starting at ground zero. Worse still, when he gets back, the budget of the project is in even worse state, and he's basically told that you have no money to build this campground with, that they are not going to be able to give him anything for supplies, essentially. A lot of people would have given up at this point.
Has Disney ever done a project that came in under budget?
I don't think I've ever heard that.
No. And that is so funny. And just, I love hearing about development stuff around this period because it just seems like so just like wild, wild west. Just nobody has a solid plan. Like it's like nothing's getting approved and signed off and all this kind of stuff. They just like give people projects and are like, yeah, go for it, do it.
Well, and that's really true too, because like if you look at it compared to now, it's like we hear more about the budget cuts and the like this isn't happening because they're trying to keep it under here and this and that. Like we hear more about the negative, but then when you look at the history of it, it's like all the people that were working on these early projects were just like guns blazing, trying to do whatever they could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, they didn't have shareholders back then, did they?
Oh, that's true.
There's the difference.
That's a big one. But anyway, so Keith Camback is in this awful position, but he's undeterred. He actually brought a trailer and parked it on the building site for the campground and lived there so that he could focus 100% of his attention on getting this done. This next part is probably my favorite story that I've ever heard in Disney history. But because Camback was told that you have a $0 supply budget for this project, he gathered a group of employees, which would become known as Campback's Raiders. And what they would do is during the day, while construction was going on at the other areas of the resort, they would take notes of supplies and building materials that were kind of lying around. And what they would do is they would come back at night. Oftentimes they would be in a pontoon boat because of all the various canals that were cutting across property. They would sneak onto these other Disney construction sites, take the materials or supplies, load them back up, bring them back to Fort Wilderness, and then tag them as though they had been Fort Wilderness's all along. And this is basically what allowed Keith Campback and his team to be able to make Fort Wilderness. The best part is that apparently at one point they also realized that they needed office supplies. So his team of raiders went to Disney's legal department that was set up in Florida. And according to the stories, they like literally raided the place, that they were emptying out filing cabinets, taking various office supplies. And shockingly, nothing happened to them because of this. So
Surprise.
Yeah. So thanks to Campback and the Raiders' tenacious efforts, the project went fairly well as it could have for having almost no time and almost no money. And even though that they fell slightly short of hitting the October 1st opening date for Disney World, the campground was open on November 19th of 1971, just a month and a half or so after the original opening date. Upon its opening, the campgrounds were a hit almost right off the bat. They attracted both long-distance travelers and also a lot of locals in the greater Orlando area that were really just looking for cool places to camp. Guests could stay at one of the 250 sites, which might sound like a lot, but if you compare it to today, there's almost 850 at Fort Wilderness. And once there, guests could take part in a number of outdoor activities, including hiking trails, horseback riding, and canoeing. And there was even a large beach that was set up along Bay Lake where guests could come and dip their toes. Though the campground would grow over the years, even in its early days, it took up a pretty large area of land. And during his planning, Campback had envisioned that they could add a train that would loop around the grounds that would be able to drop guests off near the gate or near the boats that are into the Magic Kingdom. But obviously, when he pitched this during the initial planning and construction phases, it was shut down because he had no budget to work with. But after Disney World opened and the campground opened, they realized that Fort Wilderness was really pulling in enough money to make it viable to make this railroad. And so with that, in 1972, the project was greenlit and development on the Fort Wilderness Railroad started. In 1973, the track was actually laid down, and the following year, trains that had been designed by Disney Imagineering in California were shipped back to Florida to go to Fort Wilderness. They used 4/5 model steam engines, and they were a huge hit with the guests. When it was open, from the entrance of Fort Wilderness back to the boat area where guests could take the transport boats to the Magic Kingdom, even in the early days when it was much smaller than it was now, some of the guests had almost a mile trek that they would have to take to get to the boats. And so now with this train operating, that they didn't have to walk, especially if they were carrying stuff, they really loved it. And just the fact that, it was a train and Walt loved train, and it was just so timeless and fit really well with the theming and everything at Fort Wilderness, really took off, and it was very, very popular. The tickets could be purchased for $1 a day for adults and 50 cents for children. And if you bought your ticket, you were able to use the train as much as you wanted that day. The tracks would run from the main entrance of the campground to the different loops, and then, like I said, eventually back to the area near Bay Lake where they could board the boats. At this time, Disney World was growing, and it was very clear that expansions were going to be made throughout the whole resort. And even though they were doing a lot better this time around than they were at Disneyland, the company still had the issue that guests were leaving the resort after they left Magic Kingdom. They didn't really have to look that far for inspiration to remedy this issue, though. When the Polynesian opened in 1971, they had a dinner stage show that was known as the South Seas Luau, which most people today would know as the Spirit of Aloha. And this dinner show was very, very popular, sold out nearly every night, and it was something that kept the guests staying on Disney property for nighttime entertainment. The only issue is it wasn't able to hold that many people, and they wanted to open up something similar so that they would be able to retain more of these guests. So they thought that because of the popularity and just the area that they had to expand on within Fort Wilderness, they would be a really good place to do this expansion. So they decided that the area around a restaurant within Fort Wilderness called Crockett's Tavern would be expanded into the hub for Fort Wilderness. If you've ever been to Fort Wilderness, this area is also located very close to the boats that run to Magic Kingdom. So you'll know this area now if you've ever been. It's where almost everything outside of the actual campsites and some of the pools are. This is like Fort Wilderness main area.
That's like the only part of Fort Wilderness I actually know.
I mean, it makes sense. If you're not staying at the campsites, I would assume you're probably not coming over to use the pools or doing much of the other stuff. So this is what people probably think of if they come to Fort Wilderness and they haven't stayed there. But the main addition to this area would come in the form of Pioneer Hall, which was this large log cabin style structure that they were going to build. The Imagineers wanted it to be as authentic as possible, so they actually transported trees from Montana in order to build this. I wasn't even aware that they actually even used like real log cabin construction in this building. I thought it was fake, but it was actually real log cabins and they used these timbers from Montana because they thought that it would give it a more authentic look. And I guess they figured there's not many trees really that large that grow in Florida anyway, so they had to import them from somewhere, so might as well get it from somewhere that's as authentic as possible. But inside this building, there was a large dining room where guests could eat and watch a show. And this was going to be Fort Wilderness's answer to Spirit of Aloha. Unfortunately, the construction of this building ended up going over budget. You might see that there's a theme here and with Disney in general. But so after the cost came out for how much it took to build this, the Imagineers went back to the drawing board and were trying to come up with something cheaper to put in here, at least until they had kind of recouped some of the costs. They came up with the idea. Now, granted, this is in the 70s, and hardcore Disney fans might know that Disney shot a ton of nature documentaries in the 50s and 60s. Well, their plan was to just show these nature documentaries on the screen in this theater where guests ate.
I can't imagine that would have gone over well.
Yes, and you're not the only one that thought that. Card Walker himself stepped in and said that there was absolutely no way that guests were going to pay you to sit and watch nature documentaries while they ate, and that they needed to have an actual show, just like the Polynesian had at this point. So they start going into development of this, and Card Walker goes back and forth with the Imagineers, and long story short, they're not able to agree upon a permanent show to put in this building. So because of this, Walker goes to Bob Janney, who was the VP of Entertainment, and said, "Hey, I need you to come up with something just cheap, temporary, that we can throw in here so that we at least have something while we plan the permanent show." So Janney put a small team together, and they came up with this show And in order to cut costs even further, he ended up hiring college interns to come in that were already working at Disney and be the actors in this show. And the main plan was to have just a short 11-week run with this show. And by then, they assumed that the Imagineers would have the permanent one ready to go. And this show that they put out was the Hoop-Dee-Doo Musical Revue. It was so well received that it was decided to keep it as the attraction in Pioneer Hall for the foreseeable future. This once temporary musical show has now become the longest continually running stage show in the country.
Can't believe I was
so awesome.
Temporary.
I know.
Yeah.
I've never
Beth,
seen
you said you've seen it, right?
I saw
not.
it last year.
I haven't since I was a kid, and this is one thing I've been meaning to go back and do, and I need to get around to do it, and doing this research made me want to do it even more. But yes, it is such a fantastic show.
Yeah, that's on my list of things for the next time we're down there. I'm like, I can finally squeeze Hoop-Dee-Doo, and we got to do it. We have to do it.
It's super fun and interactive, and bottomless sangria. What more could I want?
Yes, I believe all of the alcohol is bottomless.
Beer and sangria, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Can't beat
do
that.
They have other? I know this is totally off the history of Fort Wilderness, but do they have other drinks there? Or because every time I looked at it, it's always said bottomless beer and sangria.
Yeah, can I have a bottomless Coke?
Yeah.
You can get, it's bottomless whatever drink you get. They have regular sodas and tea and water and stuff like that.
Good.
I do know that Crockett's Tavern next door does have a full bar, which I'm assuming is where they would get you drinks if you weren't ordering beer or sangria. So I'm sure they at least have the option to get other mixed drinks if that's what you want.
It's probably like the whole Ohana Tambu Lounge thing where they're like right there.
Probably.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't try because there's a red and a white sangria. So
Beth was covered on all bases.
I was good to go.
Where was I?
We derailed that big time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So during the early to mid 70s now, Fort Wilderness has come out. It's become a hit. They brought the train in to give people better transportation. And now Hoop-Dee-Doo Musical Revue has been this surprise smash hit there. So things were going really, really good for Fort Wilderness. One thing, though, that hit during this time was the oil embargo. And this was impacting vacation traveling, and Disney especially felt the struggles during this time. Declining visitors caused the company to drop plans for additional hotels to be built on property, and instead wanted to try to further expand some of the areas that they already had. Because Fort Wilderness had proved popular with not only guests that were traveling from far away, but also local visitors, they thought that that would be a really good place to work on this expansion, because even if the oil embargo was keeping people from traveling long distances, they still thought that the local campers would come to Fort Wilderness. So the Imagineers had two main ideas that they pitched, and this was a pirate theme island in the middle of Bay Lake, which became Treasure Island, which eventually turned into Discovery Island, and then a water park that would be attached to the shore that was accessible through Fort Wilderness.
And is now DVC property.
Yes. But before that, what the team came up with was what was really considered the first truly themed water park, River Country. It was built on a 6-acre plot, which, to give a comparison, I believe Blizzard Beach and Typhoon Lagoon are right around 50 or 60 acres. So if you've ever been, you know that they're not very large parks. And to think that River Country was a tenth this size is even more shocking. And I remember going personally as a kid, but I also think, you know, when you're a kid, everything like seems so much bigger and more fantastic. But yeah, they they modeled this water park after a rural swimming hole and tried to keep the park looking as natural as possible. They had different rock formations that you could jump off of, and the slides were really kind of tied into these rock formations so that they didn't just stick out. And the main area that this park was built on had this pretty much one large catch pool that all of the slides or the rock jumps fed into. But the appearance of the park wasn't the only thing that was natural. The most notable feature of River Country was that guests were actually swimming in water from Bay Lake. They set up a filtration system that would pull water in from Bay Lake, send it through a number of filters, and then use that to go down the water slides and eventually feed into Bay Cove, that one large pool in the middle of the park. There was a rubber bladder system set up, and what that would allow was for the overflow water to go back into Bay Lake, but it was set up so that the water level inside of the park was actually a foot or so higher than it outside, so that the unfiltered water couldn't flow back into the park. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on River Country because we did do an episode just about it and just about everything that went wrong with it way back in the day. I think that was one of our earlier episodes for sure.
Yeah, it definitely was.
So if this is interesting to you, and go back, check that episode out. But what River Country did do was exactly what the Imagineers had planned to do. When it opened in 1976, it was an immediate success, and it frequently shut down because it would reach capacity. This had really turned Fort Wilderness into the major area of Walt Disney World outside of the Magic Kingdom. You had boat transports that ran to and from Magic Kingdom. You had lodging. You had a water park now. You had nighttime entertainment with Hoop-Dee-Doo. You had train transportation within the park, and you had recreational activities for guests to do when they got there. So even though that Magic Kingdom was, the main focus of Walt Disney World, Fort Wilderness was the first really big step that Disney and the Imagineers took to turning Disney World as a whole into this multi-day resort destination that guests would come, stay on property, and not really leave until they left Orlando. So for the most part, that's up to how Fort Wilderness kind of came about and really reached the pinnacle of what it was. This is probably Fort Wilderness at its highest point, that had all of the big major notable things in it at the time. So I'll touch on some of the other changes that came over the years, though. A lot of these aren't good, but I figured it'd be worth it to go into. The Fort Wilderness Railroad, that was such a fan favorite, had a number of issues come up only a few short years after it had opened. As Fort Wilderness itself was expanding and more camping loops were added, it became very, very difficult and costly to continue adding sections of track that would be able to go into these loops and pick guests up. The trains were also steam powered, which brought in the issue that you have to fill them with water tanks to provide water for the steam. Because these trains were smaller and were originally not meant to really be used in continuous loops, they had very small water tanks. As Fort Wilderness started becoming more and more popular, though, it was pretty much necessary for these trains to be running almost constantly. And because of that, they were having to fill up the water tanks for the trains multiple times in a day. Unfortunately, because it took a long time to fill up these water tanks, even though they were smaller water tanks than most trains would have, a lot of times what the cast members would do would fill them up, as quickly as possible and usually not completely fill them so that they wouldn't cause delays on the track. And on a number of occasions, this resulted in the trains running out of steam and the guests having to get off and walk to whatever destination they were trying to get to.
Oh.
Yeah. Another issue that came up was that even though back in 72, when this project was greenlit for Keith Camback, to go ahead and actually make the train system he wanted, they were still pretty tight with the budget that they allowed him to use. And because of that, the tracks were more or less not really built up to a standard that you would expect for a permanent railroad that was going to be operating continuously. And over time, a lot of the it was more or less just basically, it was not heavy duty enough for it to be seeing the kind of action that it was seeing. A lot of the bent sections of the track were wanting to unbend. There were multiple, I'm trying to think of how they worded this in the video that I watched on this. There were derailments, but it wasn't as dramatic as you would probably think of a train derailment being. More or less, the wheels of the train just kind of slipped off the tracks, but they would have to evacuate everybody and then bring in something that could lift the train to put it back on the tracks. And anyways, because of all of this, it was basically either going to have to be completely redesigned and rebuilt, or it was going to have to be scrapped. And almost all the time when those two options are presented to Disney, it gets scrapped. And that's exactly what happened to the Fort Wilderness Railroad. And in 1979, they finally decided to close it. However, if you are into urban exploration, which is Fort Wilderness and the surrounding areas are just like a hot spot for that, you can go and there's still sections of the track around Fort Wilderness that if you look close enough, you can find. They're very buried and they're usually in heavily wooded areas. So they're covered with dirt and leaves and everything else that's been building up for decades, but you can still find them today.
Not that we recommend or condone that.
No. Though I do think I wouldn't even necessarily call it urban exploration for this, because I think that a lot of the sections that the railroad tracks in are actually like accessible areas for guests in the park.
Okay.
Or at the campground. So I actually don't know if I've really come across them, but that'll definitely be something I look for on my next trip there.
Yeah.
In the late 90s, Disney was looking to add even more entertainment at Fort Wilderness, and this is when they opened up Mickey's Backyard Barbecue. This was another stage show, but it was held in the outdoor Fort Wilderness Pavilion, which was located right next to River Country. And it featured Southern barbecue and a stage show with Mickey, Chippendale, and a number of other Disney characters. This show was somewhat popular, but a lot of people really liked Hoop-Dee-Doo because it was kind of its own thing and didn't rely so much on Disney characters, and it was more of an original IP for Disney. But Mickey's Backyard Barbecue was also very, very popular, and the show ended up running for almost 20 years before it finally closed down on December 31st of 2018. But the most famous closure that came at Fort Wilderness was definitely River Country's. Over the years, a number of safety and health concerns had arisen. And that, along with competition from the other Disney water parks and also water parks outside of Disney, River Country was closed as it normally was in in September of 2001 for winter refurbishment. However, it didn't open the following year in 2002. Disney never came out in 2002 and officially said that River Country was getting shut down. They told guests that if there was enough demand that they would consider reopening it. But in the end, it never happened. And it wasn't until 2005 that River Country has now been sitting for over 3 years unopened with no word. They finally came out and announced that, yes, indeed, River Country was being closed down. However, the most interesting part, is Disney fans know, was that it wasn't just closed down, it was closed down and completely untouched and left for almost 2 decades for nature to slowly reclaim it.
Isn't it
until recent
interesting
years.
how they just like closed it and never reopened? Like, imagine if one night like they had just shown Wishes and then been like, yeah, well, we're not going to do that anymore. Maybe we'll bring it back. Like, and all this,
Mhm.
you know, I mean, that's just so weird. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just,
And
I guess it was just a different time.
Or if like Tower of Terror, they just shut it down one day and then like 2 years later it reopened as that Marvel whatever thing. And they just like didn't mention it.
No, and honestly, like I remember this being a kid, and when we went to Fort Wilderness, I mean, that was a huge draw, was that there's a water park there that we can just walk or ride a bike from our campground and go to. And, you know, I said on here before that, you know, staying at Disney at Fort Wilderness, we treated Fort Wilderness as like another park. And when we were planning, I mean, we would set aside, it's like, okay, yeah, that's a park day. We're going to Magic Kingdom. We're going to Epcot. You know, we'd set almost always at least 2 days aside just to hang out around Fort Wilderness. And usually one of those was more or less dedicated to going to river country. So like when that closed down, like me being a kid at that age, and especially like not even like knowing, you know, when we're getting ready to go, and it's like, well, I hope river country's open when we go. Is it going to be? Like, yeah, it was really weird that they shut it down, but didn't really say anything to anyone. But though Fort Wilderness had a number of these notable closures over the years, they also made a lot of expansions to the campground. They added a lot of new campsites, pools, and recreational areas, and also expanded a lot on the outdoor activities that you could do while you were there. And really, I think the thing that I like most of all was that even though, yes, I love river country and it got shut down, and though I never had a chance to ride on the Fort Wilderness Railroad, I would have surely enjoyed that, was that more or less Fort Wilderness had really stuck to that original idea that Walt had, where he wanted people to come and stay, but really get a chance to do adventurous things and enjoy the great outdoors. And I love that when Keith Camback got assigned this, that he really kept that in mind and really saw that through to completion. And now guests today can take part in a number of outdoor activities, go fishing, see the Chippendale Campfire Sing-Along. I would highly recommend that. You have to do that if you stay at Fort Wilderness. Ride a horse, learn from a blacksmith, take a boat out, or just explore the many places that Fort Wilderness has to offer. And if you're looking for a unique place to stay while at Disney World, I would say look no further than Fort Wilderness.
I do think at some point I want to stay here. I just have not worked the logistics of that together.
Yes.
I'm 100% never staying at Fort Wilderness, but I am going to try and take Eli to see the horses when we go at the end of this month on our off day.
Oh yeah, that'll be good. And yeah, just being able to walk around, and I can't remember last time I was there. I know they had, at least when I was a kid, a petting zoo and all that kind of stuff. I believe they did still have that when I went. But yeah, stuff like that, it's really great just to be able to like get close to the horses. And really, like when we went to, while we were checking out the horses, was when one of the blacksmiths was working. And it's really cool to actually watch them work, and they'll come up and explain to you what they're doing and everything. So it's like another one of those things where you're going and it's entertaining, but you're also getting to learn something. So
I do like stuff like that, like watching the glass blowers and all that. It's so soothing. It's like ASMR.
The only thing that I will say about Fort Wilderness, if you are going to go visit there, make sure like you kind of have an idea on where you're going, because it can be kind of confusing.
Oh yes, for sure.
We tracked a sweatshirt down to Pioneer Hall while we were there the last time, because it was the only one that had it in the size that we needed it in. And when I tell you we got actually lost in Fort Wilderness for a solid 2 hours, I'm not kidding.
Oh yeah, it's it loops around a lot. I mean, there's a major loop that goes around it, but yeah, even getting there is pretty confusing. And then once you get there, there's a ton of different campsite loops. So yeah, there's a lot to definitely to plan out. You know, we talk on here a lot about how Disney's kind of turning this vacation that you really can't just show up and go to anymore. You have to plan it out. I would say that's like doubly true if you're staying at Fort Wilderness. That being said, if any of our listeners have any sort of interest in doing this, I have done Fort Wilderness in almost every way possible. I have not stayed in a tent there, but me and my wife are actually planning on doing that at some point. I've done it in a RV. I've done it in a pull behind camper that my parents had. I have done it where you come and the third party company sets up a camper there for you. I've done it in a pop-up. So I've done it in, aside from a tent, pretty much any way that you can do Fort Wilderness. So
there are cabins too, right?
There are cabins too, but you know, that's not real Fort Wilderness.
Okay.
Nah, but seriously,
what do you think is the
that's where I would be staying if I went to Fort Wilderness.
I have not personally stayed. I haven't done it personally. I have gone on like a big family trip where some of my family members stayed in the cabins, and I can say the cabins are really nice. They are very expensive though. And they are,
to your point that's not staying at Fort Wilderness. I am looking at the room rates at Fort Wilderness and they're not showing up on there. I had to actually look up the cabins at Fort Wilderness. So
the cabins, it's a little bit
sleep
misleading.
Like 9 people though.
That's the thing, is like those are mainly built or like for large families or like groups coming to stay. Like I think like usually it's for extended lodging. Exactly. And that's what my family members did at the time that we went, and I was able to see the inside of them. But yeah, I mean, they're really nice, but again, they're expensive if you have like a small to moderate sized family.
If you're going with like a group of friends and y'all split it, then maybe it's not that expensive. I had to stay in a
cabin with my friends. Somebody would die, and I'd probably be one of them.
Oh. How does somebody have to die?
The idea of staying in a cabin is like little more than torture. I don't know.
Like even like a nice one?
Yeah, it's a cabin, and like you're just so outside and close to bugs.
You're just so outside.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
I understand. Like Fort Wilderness is definitely not for everyone. That's for sure. But if you do like outdoorsy stuff and you like Disney, it's a no-brainer.
I do want to go
You're
for
not
the day.
Bougie.
I'm not bougie. I'm just extremely classy.
Sounds pretty bougie.
Kirsten just doesn't like the outside.
No.
Kirsten's like, she wouldn't even go glamping. Gosh.
No, I would not.
So, Brian, you said you've done it every way besides a tent and actually staying in the cabins. What do you think is your like preferred way of doing Fort Wilderness?
So,
not that there's like much of a difference, I would think.
You know, it's there's one big thing that I will definitely give as a tip. Well, there's 2 big things that I'll give as a tip for people that are staying. One, that the loop that you get put in is, I mean, it's not make or break, but we would usually try to get one that was somewhat close to the central hub where Hoop-Dee-Doo and the boats were and everything, just because it made it so much more convenient to just be able to walk to the boats instead of having to worry about like renting a golf cart or riding our bikes and locking them up when you get there. So the 1 in 300 loops, if you're in the Disney Fort Wilderness are usually the ones that, I know I've talked on here before that like there's like this whole subculture of Disney people that stay at the campgrounds. But usually the 1 in 300 loops are like the really popular ones to stay at because they're located so close. So try to get those if you can, though those are normally premium sites and are usually held for RVs and full-size campers. So if you do have a pop-up or something smaller than that, they're usually going to try to put you in one of the smaller sites that are further away from those. But if you get in early enough and it's not during a super crowded time, you can normally request to get in one of those loops. So that's good. The other thing that I will suggest is, as I've said, I've done this multiple ways before. Usually within each loop is a bathhouse, and each loop has...
Wait, excuse me. A bathhouse? Is that like a communal
I'm
shower?
sorry, you must be new to camping.
Have you ever actually been camping, Kirsten?
Hell no.
It's like out in the woods. But yeah, each loop has about 30 to 40 campsites. And if you have a pop-up camper that doesn't have a bathroom, the bathhouse is going to be your main go-to. And I will say,
he is literally appalled right now at the idea of this.
I can't handle this.
I don't see. That's the thing that's so funny to me is just because I grew up camping, even outside of Fort Wilderness, and
I think one time
was just
I set up a tent outside on the trampoline, and then I got bored, and so I made my dad bring the tent into our house, and I slept in it.
That's the closest we've gotten to camping.
Yes, that's as close as I'll ever get. I learned at a very young age. So not for me.
Well, this is going to be a horror story for you then, but I would say if you are in a pop-up tent or a pop-up camper or a tent and you are not going to have your own bathroom, to take a look at the map of the loop that you're assigned to and try to get one within the loop that is close to the bathhouse within that loop. Because last time we stayed there, I was literally on the absolute opposite side of the bathhouse. And if you have to get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, that means you got to fumble around, find a flashlight, and then walk about, 75 yards to get to the bathhouse. So
this sounds barbaric.
It's rustic.
Imagine camping and not having a bathhouse. Just having it the real old-fashioned way.
Mm-hmm.
That really sounds terrible.
So the other thing that I think is probably really important to talk about with Fort Wilderness, I know we're kind of talking touring tips now, that there is internal bus systems for Fort Wilderness, isn't there?
Yes.
If I remember that correctly, they run throughout the campground. So you can probably make your way around there, but that's also very confusing too. I think. So
yes, what it is the they have an internal one that run in almost every loop, or at least if there's loops that are close to each other, will have a centralized bus stop, and these buses run to the boats and also to the main entrance. If you want to, once you get to the main entrance, there is also a place where you can take a bus to the other resort areas of the park.
Where do you check in?
The main check-in gate is actually on the complete opposite side of where the boats run. And if you're coming into Magic Kingdom, instead of going now, you go left, I think it is, to go to the resorts. You go straight ahead to go into Magic Kingdom parking, and there's a little road that cuts to the right, which runs around Magic Kingdom, and you'll drive for maybe a mile or a mile and a half, and it's really interesting to see because you come from all this heavily populated the main gates to Magic Kingdom, or at least to the TTC, and you immediately enter into this extremely heavily wooded mile section, and it's literally just you can't see through the trees on either side of you because it's so thick. And you drive for about a mile, and then there's a little turn in, and that is the main entrance to Fort Wilderness.
So I have a question for people that are not inclined to the outdoors and like country rustic stuff. Do you think Hoop-Dee-Doo is enjoyable? Because like I've never been, and honestly, I just feel like I probably wouldn't like it that much because it just seems very like rustic, like you said.
Do you like? I mean, again,
Very
last time I
punny.
went, I was fairly it's. I don't want to say this because I know it's going to immediately take you out of this. But if you like Country Bear Jamboree, I'm sure you would love Hoop-Dee-Doo Musical Revue because it's the same kind of just like silly puns and everything. But
it's
do
really
remember, like,
cool. I think it's something everybody should do at least once. Like the cast is really amazing, and they come out into the crowd, and it's very interactive, and they sing songs, and they incorporate like. I remember they went into the crowd and they asked like someone like, "Where are you from?" And he's like, "Ohio." And then they like sang a song and incorporated like the fact that he was from Ohio into it. And so it's, I don't know, it's very personal, I feel, and extremely entertaining.
Yes, I agree. And the food is really good.
Well, that does help.
Yeah, I've heard really good things about that food.
Mine
Is
was
it like,
fine, but
like
it was a
home-cooked, like
vegetarian
Southern?
option.
Yes, it's like hardcore, like Southern barbecue.
All you
cookout
care
food.
to enjoy.
I like how that's the new. I don't remember that things being called that when I was young. I feel like that's a new term.
I think that's
right?
Disney's thing.
Yeah,
It's-
it was always
it's
all you can eat is like the outside of Disney thing.
Yeah. I think Disney calls it all you care to enjoy to take away the stigma of buffets. It makes it sound nicer, not like you're just shoving your face full of food. It's like, oh, you just eat as much as you want to. You don't leave hating yourself like you do at a normal buffet, except you do.
You have to go on rides.
What about holidays at the campground?
Holidays.
We need a whole nother
probably,
podcast.
Honestly, I could talk at length for this, but I guess to touch on some of the main points is that obviously one of the big ones is at Halloween, you go trick-or-treating around Fort Wilderness, which is awesome. And again,
So
like
fun.
this whole little Fort Wilderness like subculture, like that, like people know that if you're there for Halloween, you hand out candy if you're at your camper, just like you would if you were at home. That's awesome. At Christmas, a lot of people, again, this is like not even like Disney is not a part of this. Disney does not say, hey, it's Halloween, bring candy and do trick-or-treating. At Christmas, they do this thing where most of the people, I won't say most, a lot of the people that come to Fort Wilderness bring golf carts too to help them get around. And there's an unofficial Christmas Fort Wilderness golf cart parade, and everybody will line up and they absolutely deck out their golf carts with lights and just like other decorations and stuff, and then they drive around the campground. And it's awesome because if you come to the campgrounds, you also almost always decorate your campsite if you're there for a holiday. So people, I mean, it's funny to see because like I think it's just because it's in such a compact area, but it's like people would have the same number of the like inflatables that you would put in a full-size yard, just like shoved together in their campsite. And some of it's hard to describe, but some people go so over the top, and it's so cool to see that, people take this little just like subculture thing so seriously and just have such a good time with it.
And that is definitely on my bucket list then, because little known fact about me, tacky Christmas setups are in my top 10 like favorite things of all time.
Oh, you will love this then.
Well, I, for one, am glad that you were able to put together a history of Fort Wilderness and some touring tips for us, because this is a lot of stuff that I didn't know before.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, like always.
Well, did you guys have anything else you wanted to talk about before we wrap this up? Because we've pushed a little over an hour now.
If anybody wants tips on staying at a deluxe resort, I'll handle that podcast.
Wow, it's like that, huh?
I'll order room service.
Kirsten's gonna do the Ohana room service and
How to leave your car at the valet.
oh goodness.
Two ends of the spectrum here.
Then that's going to do it for us this week. Thanks for joining us again on another episode of the Station 71 podcast. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast from. If you want to find out more information about us, you can find us online at all of our social medias at www.station71podcast.com. We hope you enjoyed your ride, and we'll see you real soon.
Please stand clear of the doors. Por favor, manténganse alejado de las puertas.